Hi there, here we go with the second lecture. So just add these to the notes that you took before. First term we want to talk about today is homeostasis. It's a very important term because when we talk about the physiology of the body and what's going on functional-wise in the body, it's all based on this term homeostasis. Homeostasis is when you are maintaining a stable internal environment. It's really important because it's what keeps you alive. So it's in order for your body to function normally, you have to maintain homeostasis. If there's an imbalance in homeostasis, that's considered to be a disturbance, and it can result in things like disease. So we want to learn about how do you maintain homeostasis. Well, one of the characteristics of life is that you can respond to your environment. And so you start with a stimulus that's going to produce some kind of change. It could be anything from going outside into bright sunlight, or you start exercising and your body is lacking oxygen. And that stimulus is received by a receptor. That receptor detects the change. Usually receptors are things like your sensory organs, but it can also be internal receptors within different organs in your body. The receptor detects the change and it sends the information to the control center along what's called the afferent pathway. The control center is your brain. So if you're going outside and it's really bright outside, your eyes are going to sense that really bright light and they're going to send a message to the brain about that bright light. The brain's then going to decide what to do, and it's going to send out information along what's called the efferent pathway to the effector organ, or the organ that can actually respond to the stimulus. It can carry out the response. And so finally you get the response of the effector, okay, and it's going to reduce the effect of that stimulus and return the variable back to the homeostatic level. That's the normal situation, okay? So your body communicates through different responses, through your nerves, okay, through your neural responses, and through your hormones also that are in your glands. So your receptor receives the information, okay, it responds to the stimulus, it sends that information to the control center. The brain decides what should be done, determines the set point. It then sends a message that's the appropriate response out to the effector organ, typically a gland or a muscle, but can be other organs as well. And now you have your ability to truly respond to that stimulus. There are two main kinds of feedback mechanisms or response mechanisms that happen in the body. The first is the most common, known as the negative feedback. It is where you're going to try to get back to that set point. And so you want to reduce the effect of the stimulus or reduce its intensity or shut it off altogether. So if you went outside and it was really hot out, you might start sweating so that you could make sure that your body temperature gets back to normal. If it's really cold out, you would start shivering. If you're exercising and you're lacking that oxygen, then your heart rate and your breathing rate are going to go up, because the set point that you're interested in establishing is the amount of oxygen in your blood and your cells. So feedback mechanisms, the whole point of negative feedback mechanisms is to reduce the effect of the stimulus so you can get back to your normal setting. There is another type of feedback mechanism. It's not nearly as common, and the idea is that you actually want to increase the stimulus or push the variable further from the set point. This would be an extreme condition. So this is known as positive feedback. And two examples in your body would be blood clotting and labor during the birthing process. So when you have your blood clotting, that's not what you normally want going on in your blood vessels. But when you cut yourself, now you do want that clot to form so you don't bleed to death. So you're actually going to, when your blood starts clotting, you're going to want it to keep clotting even more. So you're going to send the message to the brain of what's happening, and the brain's going to send the message back, hey, keep clotting. We want the brain to send that message to keep the blood clotting so that you can actually form your safe scab over that cut so you won't bleed to death. And of course, labor, you actually want the contractions to get more intense till you can finally give birth to your baby. Okay, the next part of the notes is over directional terms and the anatomical position. We'll be using these terms throughout the whole year in here because it describes where the organs are located. So when we're talking about anatomy and we're trying to figure out structures and where they're located in the body, we're going to use these directional terms. Okay? The most important thing is to start knowing what is the body position so that we know what the location is of that organ. So you got to make sure that your body is always in anatomical position before you start trying to find those organs using the directional terms. So 4 things to know about the anatomical position is 1, you're standing up, 2, you're facing forward, 3, your arms are at your side, and 4, your palms and toes are both facing forward. So you have to be in this position before you can start talking about the directional terms. So really keep that in mind to get your body in the anatomical position first. Okay, we have several sets of terms. They usually come in pairs, and they are opposing terms. So one will mean one thing, and the next term means the exact opposite. So the first 2 terms are anterior and posterior. Anterior is synonymous with ventral, and posterior is synonymous with dorsal. So you'll get to choose which terms you want to learn. Anterior means it's located in the front of the body or in front of. So if you're talking about 2 organs and you're comparing them, one would be anterior or in front of the other one. If you're just talking about where a body part's located on the body in general, you could say the belly button is an anterior structure. Posterior means the opposite. It's on the back or it's behind. So you could say your gluteus maximus or your buttocks is a posterior structure, or you could say your heart is behind your sternum. So you could say it's posterior to your sternum. The next 2 terms are proximal and distal. These are the 2 toughest terms for people to learn. For some reason, they're just a little bit harder, so you might want to spend a little bit more time studying them. These 2 terms are when you're comparing structures located on the limbs. So if you're talking about 2 structures on your arm or 2 structures on your leg, you're going to use the terms proximal and distal. Proximal means closer to the trunk of the body. Your trunk is like your chest and abdomen area put together. Okay? Distal means that it's further from the trunk of the body. So proximal means it's closer to the point of attachment, which is really your shoulders and your hips. So the closer the structure is to the shoulder on the arm or to the hip on the leg, the more proximal that structure is. The further it is from that point of attachment to the trunk, the more distal that structure is. The next 2 terms are superior and inferior. They're used when you're comparing the location of body parts that are above and below each other that are on the head or the trunk of the body. Because remember, if it's on an arm or on a leg, you need to remember that you have to use proximal and distal. So superior means that it's closer to the head or above. Inferior means it's closer to the feet or below. So you could say your head is above your heart. You could say your shoulders are above your hips or superior to your hips. Or you could say your feet are inferior to your shoulders. So as long as you're not talking about structures that are on the same limb, like an arm or a leg, you're going to use the term superior and inferior when they're above and below each other. The next 2 terms are medial and lateral. If you were to be in anatomical position and you were to draw an imaginary vertical line through your body so that you had a right side and a left side, that's called the midline. So the structures, if they're closer to that midline, they're known as medial structures, like your belly button is a medial structure. Lateral means it's further from the midline. So you could say your hip is a lateral structure because it's as far away from the midline as you can get. The next 2 terms are superficial and deep. Superficial just means that it's towards the surface of your body, and deep means it's away from the surface or it's a more internal structure. So when you get a superficial cut, it means it's not very deep at all. It's very shallow cut. It's very close to the surface of your body, like a paper clip might be superficial. Whereas if you gouge your leg, that might be a deep cut, which is probably going to be more serious because now you're dealing with more internal damage. Those were all the directional terms. Now we're going to talk about planes and sections of the body to end this lecture. A plane divides your body, your entire body, into 2 halves. A section only divides a part of the body. So the first section we're going to talk about is, the first plane we're going to talk about is the frontal or coronal plane. It's going to divide your body into a front and a back half. So you'd have to turn the body to the side, saw right down the center line, and you'd end up with the front and a back half. That would be the frontal plane. Okay, it's going to divide it into a front and a back. The median or mid-sagittal plane divides the body into right and left sides, or right and left halves. So it's called the median because it's right along the middle. If you know, the median of your highway is right in the middle of the east and west or south and northbound lanes. So the median plane goes right through the center of your body, creating a right and a left half. The transverse plane divides the body into superior and inferior halves, so a top and a bottom half. Finally, the sagittal section is going to divide the body part into right and left halves. Not the whole body, just a body part. That's why it's now known as the sagittal section instead of the sagittal plane. So if you're going to take anything, an arm, a leg, your head, your brain, and you're going to divide it into a right half and a left half, you would create a sagittal section within that body part so that you could end up with those two halves. That's it for the lecture, but you might take a second to pause the screen and practice a little bit before you come to class to see how good you are with these directional terms. So use the word bank and see if you can fill in each of those 12 sentences. If you have any questions, make sure you write them down so that I can go over them at the beginning of class before we maybe do a review clicker activity. All right? Have a good evening.